A very good evening, one and all. We welcome you all, history enthusiasts, once again to our vibrant channel. And today we have with us Professor Lavanya Vemsani. She is a professor, Department of Social Sciences, Shawnee State University, and also the president of Ohio Academy of History, USA. Ma'am, on behalf of myself, Nidhi, and all our viewers, we welcome you, ma'am. We are very happy to have you on our virtual platform today with us. I also welcome all our audience, our viewers, whose support and love is what has brought us so far. So, 2 beautiful years. I also welcome my friend and my the co-founder of our page, Miss Nidhi Katti. Welcome, Nidhi. Without any further ado, I request Miss Nidhi Katti to introduce our today's resource person.
Thank you, Manali. Thank you so much. Dr. Lavanya Vemsani is multi-award winning scholar and distinguished university professor of history at Shawnee State University in the Department of Social Sciences. Vemsani ma'am is also the honorary visiting professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi in the Department of Historical Studies. Ma'am holds 2 doctorates in the subjects of religious studies, MC Master University, Hamilton, Canada, and History, University of Hyderabad, India, respectively. Ma'am's research and teaching interests are interdisciplinary and multifold. She researches and publishes on subjects of ancient history and religions as well as the current history of India. Vemsani ma'am's books include Feminine Journeys of the Mahabharata, Hindu Women in History, Text and Practice, Krishna in History, Thought and Culture, an encyclopedia of the Lord of Many Names, Hindu and Jain mythology of Balarama, Hinduism in text and context, in addition to a number of articles on history and religions of India. Her upcoming books include Hinduism in the Middle India, Narasimha, the Lord of the Middle India, A New History. She is the editor in chief of the International Journal of Indic Religions from 2020 to 2023, American Journal of Indic Studies from 2018 to 2020, International Journal of Dharma and Hindu Studies from 2015 to 2017, and associate editor of uh, Canadian Journal of History, the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, and Journal of South Asian Religious History from 2017 to 2020. Professor Vemsani ma'am has served as president of Ohio Academy of History from 2018 to 2021. It's an honor and privilege to have ma'am on the History Enthusiast platform. And her books, when I was reading her biodata, her books inspired me so much that after this lecture, I'm surely going to order those books, ma'am. So thank you so much. I was really inspired by your biodata. It's an honor to introduce Vemsani ma'am on the platform of the History Enthusiast. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nidhi,
Thank
for
you.
the introduction.
Thank you
Uh,
so much for the great introduction, Nidhi. Thank you.
yes. So now I request Professor Lavanya ma'am to begin the lecture.
Thank you, Manali, for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor to be here and share my research. It's my pleasure to be sharing my research today. And gender and Shakti and feminine divine is very close to my heart. So this subject is very close to my heart. So I'm very happy to be sharing my research on this subject today. Thank you for having me. Shakti, feminine divine in text and practice. I will be focusing on Indian practice. India has vast practice as well as textual tradition. So, feminine divine has been largely underserved by the academia. Much ink and time has been spent examining her, but only in a slanted way. leading to more confusion and contested arguments than true understanding. I will discuss, how this leads to a confusing understanding later on in the lecture. India is the only nation in the world still holding on to worshipping the feminine divine and placing her at the center of all issues concerning life. There won't be a village in India without goddess shrine. Historic shrines of goddesses are noticed in India from Middle Paleolithic era onwards. Goddess worship is noticed across the world initially, but currently goddess remains remarkably central only to India and Indian religion and culture. She has lost her place of prominence in many other societies over the millennia, sadly. Even though, but her culture is being misunderstood in the modern era due to misinterpretations. So that's what I would be focusing today. Text and practice centered on the feminine divine is vast in India. My book, Feminine Journeys of the Mahabharata, focused on the representation of feminine divine in the Mahabharata as well as other classical texts. Similarly, aspects of feminine divine is preserved Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and Sikh traditional texts and practice. I am currently undertaking two subsequent studies on the feminine divine because the present work only focused on representations of the Mahabharata. So the first one focuses on feminine divine in Jainism, and the other focusing on understanding concepts of gender and general perceptions of family in India. The gender perceptions are also linked to feminine divine. We'll be speaking about it in a little bit. For today's lecture, I'm focusing on understanding the feminine divine, the Shakti in general, and goddess Kali in particular. The presentation is divided into three sections. Section one focuses on the academic study of the feminine divine. Section 2 focuses on the basic conceptualizations regarding the Shakti, the feminine, based on my book, Feminine Journeys of the Mahabharata. Section 3 focuses on understanding the modern concepts and practice centered on the feminine divine. The subject of feminine divine, as well as divine feminine and heroic feminine, is fascinating. Naturally, stories of feminine from classical texts of India attracted scholarly attention. There are numerous trends that commonly dominate the analysis of stories of female protagonists, both feminine divine and feminine heroic. However, it is not my intention here to discuss all the trends in detail, but efforts are made here to broadly categorize what is happening within the field of study, academic study of the feminine divine. It can be understood in three categories. The first category is overemphasis on female sexuality, objectification of the subject. More focus is given to how the goddess looks rather than how the goddess symbolically represents. For example, Kali is misunderstood completely. She's called Black Goddess or all kinds of goddess, violent goddess, and all things. But the symbolic representation is missing from most of the analysis. Categorization and labeling is the next framework that was used. Anytime goddesses are studied, uh, they're they're labeled, they're classified into different categories. They're called mother goddesses, or spouse goddesses, or wild goddesses, or village goddesses, or derogatory terms such as breast goddess or tooth goddess, which is really derogatory. It's close to saying, calling the goddesses names. So This trend is very common. Probably you all might have noticed it. And the third one is applying theoretical frameworks that really do not apply to the feminine divine or feminine in general in India. For example, the psychoanalytical frameworks should not be applied to to divine. In any case, the storytelling is different, should not be applied, and it should not be applied to the dead anyway. So these are applied to the devotees, the dead devotees, dead enlightened devotees of goddesses, which is also completely misses the point of studying the goddesses and the devotees and the practice. So this mistaken perceptions, mistaken classifications, mistaken analytical frameworks led to misunderstanding the goddesses rather than helping us understand the goddesses. So I will discuss these three aspects in detail. Literary and religious space of the feminine decreased gradually. There is only there is only a little bit of space given to her, because the whole world is moving towards God-centered world. So any goddess-centered world, any goddess-centered thought is considered marginal, is considered out of the way. It's not considered mainstream. So it's seen that way. It is studied that way. There are only few striking stories recollected in the classical text and women's history also. However, these are then analyzed, um, not in a complete way. This also resulted in examining the narratives of only those feminine that are considered out of the normal style of marriage, such as because they are considering the women with in comparison with the men. So the women are studied as wives or mothers or some kind of relationship in with regards to the women, with regards to the men. If they're not related to the men, they are some way uh, out of the normal, and they are considered, wild goddesses. So more attention is paid to Draupadi, Kunti, and Urvashi, because there is a lot to study: objectification, sexualization, and all these categorizations can be applied very easily to them, and um, very easy to change this narrative. So while neglecting other stories of the heroic women as normative, such as Savitri and Shakuntala, they did not receive the same type of attention that the stories of Draupadi, Kunti received. They received all this categorization, the sexualization, objectification, the applying of the terms, and also they received this psychoanalytical treatment also, um, which is misleading, but still. So, um, uh, st- in their quest to find legitimacy for expression of what is considered proper womanhood in relation to the men in their life, either goddesses or women, doesn't matter any feminine they are studying. The relationship to the man is important. So. Excessive attention has been paid to women's sexuality, ignoring other aspects of the woman's life. The partisan understanding of women's tales resulted in them being treated as puzzles of their activities and presentations discounted as anomalies rather than normative. Scholarly examination of classical texts is treated as um, solving a puzzle. Most of the time, they also admit that we're solving a puzzle here. We're trying to show what is the answer here, as if the divine is not personified, not identified already. Interviewing some practitioners would easily tell us what the identity and what the personification of such goddess is. But the scholars haven't done that. Sometimes connecting disparate information from different categories of text which do not fit together, even though no textual support for such connection could be established. So they solve this, they establish the puzzle by finding little bits of information from different texts, even though there is no direct connection. For example, Amba, Ambalika, and the goddesses, their names are accidentally used in a Vedic ritual. So, but there is no connection to the Mahabharata and their birth, and it's not mentioned anywhere. But scholars used it as an evidence and said that I believe the others have found pieces of the puzzle that was not known. So so disparate information is put together to show them as bizarre, not really identified as the practitioners understand them to be. Male perspectives. Male perspectives discounted the value of women's dialogue, framing it as non-womanly or no typical female argument can be identified. So women most of the time is sidelined for their activities, even when they are speaking for themselves. For example, Draupadi speaks in the Sabha, and Kunti speaks, makes her arguments known. So when this happens, these arguments are not taken at face value, not taken as a woman's argument, but it's taken as something learned from men, or something secondary. And they have written this. It's not just a postulation, it is written down. It is said that the argument can be identified or as apadharma, but not as showcasing their independent thinking. In addition, it is also said that they might not be as smart to frame arguments on their own, but borrow the ideas from listening to the men, from silent proximity of being listeners. So women's learning, women's understanding, women's arguments are discounted, even when they are present, even when they are seen. Intellectual debates embedded in Draupadi and Kunti are discounted in this way. Um, Women's leadership has never been explained as courageous or appropriate, appreciating the intellectual characteristics of the feminine heroics, but it had always been considered as an influence from their male compatriots, or as something out of the normal. Um, if anything that is happening, that is only happening, because of their sexuality or sexual behavior. Anything other than that is, secondary. Categorization and labeling. This is another issue with academic studies. Many of the academic studies have attempted, and I have said all these categories that are applied to the goddesses. Um, the so this trend, categorization of the feminine divine, is the favorite pastime of some early scholars. These scholars had spent much time and ink on discussing and categorizing goddesses into distinct categories, sometimes even going on to the extent of coining very derogatory names uh, to categorize those invented categories. These categories don't exist in Indian understanding or Indian practice or Indian worship. Some of the terminology applied to this categorization makes obvious the deep-seated sexist, misogynist interpretation of goddesses, heroic women, as these categories are based on evaluating and labeling women's relationship to men. What is even more egregious is that those same scholars have made no such attempts to categorize male gods who display equally outlandish behavior and sexual obscurantism. Even female scholars who followed this trend, either unknowingly or due to natural tendency of the academia, used these categorizations without questioning. The categorization remained prevalent until recent times. It's only in the last decade that they began recognizing this. And many scholars are gradually speaking up. So this trend hopefully would be discontinued, but I would say this is still common in the academia, and I hope this trend would be discontinued as soon as possible. Despite the fact that the labels like spouse goddesses sounds as derogatory as spouse god, these types of categorizations persisted. The categorizations against originate from male perspective of analyzing. So definitely there is scope for improvement in this area. A scope for improvement in both the areas, but this area definitely this is immediately necessary. Um, this is really not useful. It is surprising that these perspectives persisted, irrespective of whether the researcher was male or female, which shows the normalization of entrenched thought process, obviously steeped in male perspectives. The futility of this partisan categorization becomes obvious in the light of the examination of female heroic personalities and goddesses in the Mahabharata. I have noticed this throughout my study. The division between terrifying and family type feminine, as well as the wife and sister goddess, is not always clearly demarcated. But these categories are applied as a rule anyway. These categorizations are not only futile, they are also outright misogynist. For example, Ganga, regarded as the mother of all, is also associated with death. Known as the most domicile goddess, is also associated with blood, death, sacrifice in her association with and identification with Ekanamsa and Nidra. Some scholars even thought it pertinent to take the categorization out of the context of religion to format a commentary on the larger Indian society of the 20th century, providing continuity to support the initial misogynist colonial Western perspectives of Indian society. So some scholars even went on to say, how an unmarried woman would be, how a married woman would be, how the goddess categorizations also can be seen in Indian society, which is even more derogatory. The categorization is faulty to begin with, and then applying it to the general society of women and men in India is even more derogatory and misogynist and colonialist. Some have gone even further to formulate a theory uh, to show that the goddesses, the wild goddesses, have been married, softened, and they became spouse goddesses, and that's how we have all these nice goddesses in India, which is also another colonialist trope in this category. It appears that the natural course of historical evolution and cultural change is reflected in the changes. For example, the goddess between the first century to the 20th century, her appearance is very similar, but the way we worship, the way we dress, the way we celebrate, the dances we perform may change over time. It only shows the changes within our culture rather than changes to the goddess. So, calling the changes, the general changes that are happening within the culture, to be affecting the personality of the goddess is short sighted. It doesn't help us understand the goddess in any way. The stereotypical divisions and labels persist regardless of whether male or female researchers undertake this, and I already noted this, which is also very strange. At least the women should notice this kind of partial understanding. However, the misogynist and partisan nature of such labels and analysis are noticed, and scholars are gradually changing, resisting this temptation. So, my study, the close study of heroic women of the Mahabharata, reveals that sexuality of the males and females hadn't been the concern of larger society at all, as most of the sexuality is reported as matter of realistic fact without any commentary. Mahabharata actually reports gender fluidity and all kinds of sexuality without any commentary, without offering any derogatory or supportive commentary, which is the realistic depiction of gender understanding in India. Sexual behavior of females is the concern of modern scholarship rather than the classical Indian society in the age of Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Sexuality and marital lives of Draupadi, Urvashi, Savitri, and Kunti, as well as the gender ambiguity of Amba, are discussed in detail without censure, which proves the larger society's openness as well as acceptance of differing sexuality. An effort is also made to discuss all these issues throughout my book, which showed that gender is an important aspect of society, but objectification is not noticed in the Mahabharata. The Indian understanding of gender is fluid and multiple. The being or person is seen as a combination of masculine and feminine within one. Balance of these essential qualities is what defines one's gender. Strict gender normalization prohibiting flexibility is anathema to Indian society and religious and cultural practice. Gender normalization is late medieval and early modern phenomenon in India. Classical texts abound in gender floating stories and practices. Hence, many of these theories of objectification and labeling some divinities as well as devotees derogatorily is nothing short of implicating the culture as backward. For example, somebody conducted a study of the well respected enlightened sage of India, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, applying psychoanalytical theories and applying gender normalization, only to misrepresent and present Ramakrishna Paramahamsa's practices in a misogynistic way and in a totally wrong perspective. The next point that I'm taking up is retrofitting theories. This is another problem. That is the psychoanalytical theories, applying psychoanalytical theories is another problem. So it is possible that the examination of women's stories as part of overarching theoretical perspectives may have contributed to slanted understanding of powerful roles of women. We must remember that the feminine leaders whose stories were memorialized and recollected in epic tales lived their lives according to their own convictions and opportunities afforded to them, rather than illustrate some overarching modern psychoanalytical theories. Therefore, applying the modern theories constrict the stories into frameworks that were introduced or theorized later and which were alien to the Indian culture. And it's also do not belong to the same period. We must also remember that the stories themselves might have been subjected to a variety of changes in the process of their final composition millennia ago. It is not my intention to launch into lengthy discussion on this subject here, but to indicate that I veered away from applying such theories to my analysis of feminine leaders that I studied in the book. It is my conviction that studying women's stories for who they are and how they conducted themselves under the unique circumstances under which they lived, as depicted in the stories, would be much more fruitful to understand and identify and personify the symbolic nature of these goddesses rather than applying these narrow frameworks. Sometimes the absence of straightforward evidence for applying Freudian psychoanalytics, it is proposed that it should be applied widely rather than as it is applied to Eurocentric nuclear family on which this theory is based. They know this is not applicable. That's why they're saying, within the book, they're saying, okay, it cannot be applied as it is applied in the Eurocentric family, but we should apply it more widely. Why should we apply it more widely? It doesn't help understand Indian society or Indian goddesses or Indian religious culture. What is the point of applying this? So, the perhaps it might serve the academic examination well. At this point, if it is realized from this clear analysis that Freudian psychoanalytics might not be applicable to the stories of Mahabharata or to any divine feminine. If it is required one to give up the basic tenet of the theory, the nuclear family. We must remember that the characters, especially feminine heroics, acted in the way that was conducive to them under the circumstances available to them, and they were not living in 20th century world but an ancient world more than 2000 years ago, probably 3000 years ago. They are not modeling a scientific theory throughout their life, but later scholars are applying these narrow scientific theories to find meaning which shows their own lack of conscience rather than anything about the goddesses. It only shows their narrow goals and their narrow understanding than the real understanding of the goddesses. So, so in this book, in the Mahabharata, in the feminine journeys of the Mahabharata, I stayed away from all these three things: the labeling, the sexuality and objectification, and applying uh, psychoanalytics. But I used a new framework, the Indian framework of understanding one's life as a holistic journey. So that's what I do here. I take each feminine heroic from the Mahabharata and study it as a holistic life journey of the feminine rather than take sections of it and analyze it using different narrow theories. So theories and frameworks are developed through observation of life. They are most frequently based on modern life and frequently on Western societal life. So, due to this, the theoretical frameworks that were previously used are not useful for us. We have to use what is useful and what is clearly derived from Indian culture. The Indian culture sees one's life as a holistic journey on the earth. So, um, so now I'm going into the feminine journeys, my book. What I did in this book, what my goal was in this book, and what I accomplished in this book. I will briefly talk about it. If there are any questions, we can discuss later. Researchers are hampered frequently by the limited nature of information available in the stories of the feminine. But that's not the question for us. Mahabharata preserves large stories of the feminine. It has undergone through numerous recensions, but still preserves the stories of the feminine divine and feminine heroics intact. So we have long stories recounting stories from their birth to the end of their life, going on sannyasa and everything. Uh, Even though because these characters are from ancient society, the characters have limited scope. So even though the feminine leaders have limited roles and opportunities, they excelled meeting challenges strewn on their path. However, in the matters of their choice, how independently they exerted their mind and character is amazing and helps understand the women in numerous perspectives. Even though the stories may have been preserved partially or truncated somehow, they still preserve large stories of the women and show us in their strength. One of the most striking features frequently ignored with regard to the feminine leaders depicted in the Mahabharata stories is that the feminine personal choice and strength to adhere to that choice in the face of multiple difficulties. All of the feminine that we have noticed here undertake difficult journeys. But the choice is theirs. Most of the time, when study is conducted, their choice and their arguments in regard to that choice are ignored. One of my central goals in this book is not to formulate frameworks, but to use the framework that is available to us, derived from Indian culture. So it's a study of life journeys. Hence, analyzing the narratives of women from classical texts not only helps understand their historical and religious significance, but this analysis also would help understand the historical culture and religion of India. As a subsequent cultural consequence of the narratives, analysis of current historical cultural practices preserved in theater, festivals, and rituals give additional information to understand the underlying processes of historical evolution of the feminine throughout the history. So, for example, Draupadi's story is preserved in the Mahabharata, long story, but her story is also preserved in oral tales, in theater, and festivals. Draupadi festival is performed across southern India, especially in Tamil Nadu. So this shows us, if we study all aspects, the artistic, the ritualistic, as well as the classical literary aspect, we will understand the historical journey of this feminine heroic, how her personification happened, how her identity has symbolized some aspects of our culture, and how this culture again is reflected in the practice, in our rituals, as well as in our theater performance that is conducted. So this is true of most of the heroic leaders and most of the feminine divine represented in the Mahabharata. If we study only one aspect, we are not going to really understand the real personification and real understanding of the Shakti that is embedded in them. I employ the word feminine divine, rather than instead of usual terms like female or goddess or women to denote this gender, because feminine is an all-embracing term rather than these other terms which were used somewhat in a degenerate way in the past. Classical Indian understanding of the personhood is reflected through the blend of masculine and feminine in the innate nature of a human being. Hence, this is also reflected in the literary texts of classical India. In addition to journey through the feminine and masculine is also noted in the story of Amba. I discussed it in the book also. Uh, she undertakes difficult penances and then undertakes gender change. So feminine journeys of the Mahabharata studies the feminine in their own right. The stories of the feminine leaders are studied for the sake of knowing the feminine in their excruciating as well as courageous movements of life, to understand the personification and understanding of the Shakti, the divine feminine. Due to the prevalent trends of examination, the study of women in the Mahabharata has missed the discerning eye of the researcher. Most of the studies were devoted to the study of the understanding of women in their traditional roles, in their domestic sphere, in relation to the men in their life. Uh, my book provides an unique opportunity to open up new discussion in feminine personal choice, where the stories and symbols designate the status of the women out of the ordinary. All the women examined in the book lived an extraordinary life, riddled with trouble and travails, which brings out the heroic nature of women. Hence, it helps to understand the feminine, the heroic, the feminine divine that Indian culture has placed at its center. Indian culture has always valued feminine divine as well as masculine divine, both aspects of the divine. Indian culture never placed one at the center and ignored the other, which is also understandable through our study. Um, Most of the feminine heroics have journeyed through forests. So my study actually gives centrality to understanding exile. So exile, forest, and isolating journeys are part of the stories. And these are utilized to understand the special identity and personality of the goddesses that is brought forward. For the convenience of analysis and understanding each story, because each of them is a life story, each story is uniformly divided into 5 stages. So So the five phases are actually the birth, the initial, and then the three phases of young adult life and life, and then the final stage is the sannyasa and the final decision that she makes. So each stage shows how our heroics have modeled their life with their own conviction. The lives of Mahabharata, Draupadi, Damayanti, and Savitri, and all of them showed courage and feminine choice in the way they conducted their life. So, in addition to the Mahabharata, I also used Kalidasa's texts, Abhignana Sakuntalam and Vikramorsiyam, and also used Basa's plays, Urubanga, because studying wider representations helps us understand the personality and the values that the society has placed in understanding the divine feminine. Hence, in the stories of women, one should not look to the women's journeys show how the women are actually represented, right? It is necessary to employ the cultural symbolism connected with women in order to understand the true nature of women, are feminine divine in the classical stories. So in the case of feminine divine, when the narratives are examined, one should be cautious to employ different parameters. Hence, in the stories of feminine heroics and feminine divine, one should not look to the return. In the case of male, it's always the return and achieving the final goal. But for women, the journey itself is symbolic because Shakti represents moving force. Feminine is defined and depicted as a moving force, not as a static force. The the concept of Shakti itself is force and energy that moves. So her journey cannot be seen as static. It should be seen as moving. So we have to analyze the journey rather than the return. So the book, The Feminine Journeys, uses these frameworks. It uses the five stages of life to understand the holistic life. And it also uses this understanding of seeing woman as a changing, evolving person within her journey rather than as a static person. So these both actually helped understand the true characterization, true personification, true analysis, true representation of feminine divine as well as feminine heroic within Indian culture. For example, Draupadi is connected to Kali, Durga, and worshipped as the goddess. Her connection is symbolic to Kali and Durga. Some scholars have taken it as a true representation, but it's a symbolic connection. Draupadi resembles Durga as the great goddess to bring an end to evil in the world, and she represents Kali as in her representation, in her symbolic aspects, as end of time. Kali is also misunderstood, right? Kali was discussed as dark goddess and violent goddess and all that. But Kali is actually a symbolic of end of time. Just like Kala, Mahakala is the representation of end of time. He wears skulls and appears scary. Same way, Kali is feminine divine of the end of time. Because she represents end of time, she appears scary and she appears with skulls and she appears in a different personification. But that is misrepresented, misunderstood. When we connect these concepts with how symbolically she connects with Draupadi, then we can understand what is actually being represented here. Mahabharata war actually represents the end of the Dwapara age and the beginning of the Kali age. So, as a goddess, Draupadi represents this end of time, the Kali symbolism embedded in her, because she represents this end of this era and then beginning of the new era. Not a real representation of killing or death or any of such things. Um, so we are coming to the end, and I will conclude just by offering my understanding of the Shakti here. Shakti is the energy, the moving force behind everything and every being in this creation. Indian religions understand the masculine as the material force, while the feminine as the moving innate force. That is responsible for carrying forwards the functions of the nature, the prakriti. When the material force, the innate force are in balance, the world is in harmony. And when the harmony is disturbed, there are issues of disease, calamity, and death. The masculine and feminine divine is finely conceptualized in Hindu representation of the universe. Since the feminine force is the leading force behind the changes within the universe, the goddess is worshipped at every notable calamity, may it be disease, death, or other life changing events. In this concept, it must also be noted that the goddess Kali is misunderstood in her basic representations due to the confused interpretations of studies based on her. Kali is the feminine representation of end of time, as we already noticed, very similar to Mahakala. And understanding these concepts, the symbolic concepts as well as the personification, would help us understand the real understanding of feminine divine within Indian culture and Indian religions. Um, Therefore, because Kali represents an end of time, she appears scary, but she is also inspiration because she brings new, right? Therefore, Kali is taken as an inspiration during difficult times also. That affect mankind, such as disease, wars, and death. Um, One such calamities period in Indian history was colonization. And it was also no surprise that Kali served as an inspiration for freedom movement. For many of our freedom leaders have actually placed Durga and Kali at the center of freedom movement during the war for independence. So the concept of mother goddess and inspiring goddess as an end to evil is represented by Durga and Kali together and served as inspiration, served as feminine divine representation of the feminine divine within Indian culture for a long time. So what does this mean for us in the modern world? What can we think about it? Right. One of the general questions I frequently receive is what makes the goddess attractive to the general society, right? I think the question is mute. The goddess should be as attractive to any society as the god, right? The feminine and masculine are but the partial representation of the world, universe, and the divine. One cannot ignore one large half in favor of the other large half. Women make half the world. It's only natural that the feminine divine makes the rightful half of the divine world. I really think the modern world is waking up to the realities of revering and understanding the less known aspects of divinity in the feminine aspect rather than focusing on the single aspect of the masculine. So for the modern world, I think this is a beginning. The concepts are changing. And what makes it attractive to the West? Many of them ask me also about this. Um, the feminine divine had been kept away from the mainstream practice in the West for centuries, that even smaller attempts to reclaim or embrace the feminine divine appear rebellious, are termed feminist in the Western understanding. But I think this is something inevitable. As the world becomes more equitable, there would be an embrace of the feminine in every sphere, including the divine. Is this an era of the feminine divine? I definitely think so. The world is gradually embracing and realizing the power of the feminine divine in conceptualization as well as in practice. As a society, we are getting closer to understanding the feminine divine. Are we embracing the deeper concepts of the feminine within all of us? I think so. That is a good thing. We are getting closer to understanding the feminine and realizing the feminine side of the universe. I think which would result in a positive change for the world. So, thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was such a refreshing lecture. Actually, I want to confess here, as you mentioned, we as research scholars, young research scholars, immature researchers, we might also be guilty of following the pre-existing categorization of the feminine divine into various groups, mother goddess or spouse goddess or all that. And we have done so without questioning so far, because that is what has been taught to us, and that's what we have been reading so far. But we are really grateful to you for showing us the right path and bringing this new perception to us, because I think that is the correct perception, what you have just told us. It is not necessary to label the feminine divine or the feminine heroic as something. She has her own identity as a human being, as a person, and that's enough. So, ma'am, actually, I have a couple of questions. Uh,
Please, please,
yes,
thank
ma'am.
you.
Yes, ma'am. The first question is, uh, there are stories of gender fluidity, as you mentioned in Mahabharata and many other classical works. So, when did that change? When did gender rigidity become the norm of the society, and what might have been the reasons for that?
I basically I would think I have to do a little bit more study on this, but early modern it's crystallized in the early modern era. We can see this in British administration and all that. But we can also see it gradually changing during the medieval era also. So I would say the mid-millennial crisis, the 1500 crisis has led to a complete change in Indian thought process and Indian understanding. India had been through numerous wars and struggles and difficulties. So the mid-millennial crisis has changed Indian society so much. So I would think it slowly changed the perceptions and understanding from that time onwards, which were finally crystallized during the British administration. I would think so.
Thank you, ma'am. There's a question from Dr. S.K. Aruni, sir, in the comment section. He says, my curious question, how to historicize the Indian epics, namely Ramayana and Mahabharata? If so, what could be the dates of these epic wars?
These are historical anyways. These are accepted as historical. But the question is when they were composed. So when literary historians are talking about Mahabharata between 300 BCE to 300 CE, they are only talking about historical composition of the epic. But the epic was known before, because the epic is referred before in 800 BCE as Jaya Samhita, and there is evidence also for that. So there is evidence that it had happened long time before, but the story was only put in written form during the first millennium BCE. So what we are discussing here is the question of when it was written down, rather than if it happened or not happened, or if it is historical or not historical. The historicity of both epics are accepted in general in the historical world.
Thank you, ma'am. Professor R.M. Shadaksharaya sir has written, what about the various goddesses of Jains and Buddhists as mentioned in the text? I also have one question to add to that. As I'm studying, my PhD is based on Jainism and Buddhism. I also want to ask, how is the perception of the feminine divine in Jainism different from that of Hinduism and even Buddhism?
Right. It's a little bit different, but still represents Indian culture and Indian perceptions of women. This is a very, very important question. That's the reason I'm undertaking a separate study of women in Jainism. Jainism brings forward understanding of the women, but in a spiritualistic and materialistic perspective. So it brings out another aspect of Indian culture. So Buddhism, of course, we know, the tantra and the yoga, and it's multifold. So So Indian culture, and of course Sikhism also has important perspectives on women. So Indian religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism preserve the central feminine divine, central aspects of the identity, and the personification of the feminine that we notice in India, but they all do it in their own way. While I was working on Kunti, Draupadi, and Damayanti, Savitri, in Hinduism, I also found equally important stories, narratives in Jainism also. So, so they represent, of course, important aspects, but in their own way. So this doesn't show that they all oppose each other. This shows the multiplicity of Indian culture, how Indian culture represented the feminine divine, and how central it is to Indian culture, and how multiple perspectives of the feminine divine are still preserved in all these traditions. So it's important to
True.
study. I'm still
Absolutely,
at the
ma'am.
beginning. I'm still at the beginning of my study, so I cannot say much. But it's ongoing and it'll be out soon. So yeah, it's an important study that we should do.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. As you mentioned, the multiplicity of Indian culture, it is much evident in all of these different perspectives of the feminine divine, which are there in the different religions of India. And even though they have differences, they all bring it together, and it is one united picture. So that is the uh, uh, thing that we have to understand. Nidhi, do you have anything to add to this?
Yes, actually, I have some questions. So, um, ma'am, as you told that Kali is representative of Draupadi, but there are many stories that tell Kali as the Uparupa of Gauri, wife of Shiva. So we have listened these stories from our childhood. So what exactly is the truth?
That's obvious, right? Gauri and Kali are the two sides of the feminine divine. And of course, definitely, Kala Shiva is the end of time, the male side, and Kali is the female side, the end of time. So naturally, right, that shows the balance, and of course, the Ardhanarishwara, it shows the holistic conception of the universe. So it's symbolic as a way to understand the feminine divine and masculine divine as equal forces, um, commanding the world rather than one dominating the other.
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am. I would like to read some of the comments.
Yes.
Professor Ravi Korishettar has said hi, ma'am. And Professor Usha Devi, madam from Bengaluru University, has written a wonderful presentation. I have one observation about women education in Ramayana and Mahabharata. We would like to listen to that, but madam has not yet written.
I
There is a
haven't yet.
question, Manali.
Yes,
Okay.
Shadaksharaya sir has asked, do you feel that Draupadi, Kunti and others are treated as feminine divines in India?
They are treated divine. That's not feeling. I don't have to feel it. They are treated as feminine divine and worshipped as goddesses. And Draupadi worship is big practice in southern India. You also know that. So yeah. So it's not a feeling. It's there. It is still there. It is still practiced.
Yes, ma'am. Indeed, even in Jainism, there are the names of 16 Mahasatis, which are chanted
Mm-hmm.
regularly by the devotees. So Draupadi,
Yeah.
Kunti, Sita, all these Damayanti, these names are always there on that. They are always treated as
Right.
goddesses.
Right. They are
But
goddesses and they are
ma'am,
remembered. They are worshipped and inspirational.
but ma'am, I want to know that we have temples of Lakshmi and Saraswati, who are submissive goddesses. Like they are not like Kali, but we don't have any temples for Draupadi. Uh, Mostly, I think one or two we may have. Uh, as frequently we see Lakshmi and Saraswati temples, we don't have Draupadi temples. So why is it so? If we are worshipping her, then why are we not worshipping her in temple and in puja grahas of houses?
Yeah, yeah. Draupadi is worshipped, and of course, there is this Draupadi Ratha in Mahabalipuram. Probably
Yes, it's
historically there might have been temples. I would think so. There might have been temples, and in mid millennial crisis, we lost most of our temples. So probably we lost them. I would say historically there might have been temples of Draupadi. She might have been worshipped, and I have seen Pancha Pandava temples in which Draupadi is also there, because Draupadi is part of this group, right? She's not seen as a separate goddess. That's one thing. And second thing is, maybe we are so selfish. We are all worshiping goddesses. That provide
That's
us.
something.
Yeah, somehow they give us something, right? Lakshmi and Saraswati. So we are drawn towards them, but that doesn't mean that we are ignoring the others.
yes,
We recite their names, we celebrate their festivals, so they're always there. And temples probably historically there, but probably lost.
Thank you so much, ma'am. If anybody has any other questions, please leave it in the comment section. Later on, we can get the answers for you. We have, I think, come to the end of this lecture. Uh, it was really a very informative and very enlightening lecture, ma'am, because as I mentioned, it was something new for us, a new perspective for us to look at the feminine divine and the entire concept of feminine. And uh, yes, Professor Usha Devi madam has asked clarification for her observation.
Sure.
Okay, she wants to know about education of women in Ramayana and Mahabharata.
Mahabharata, I talked about it in the book. Mahabharata, all the feminine heroics examined in the book are decently educated, and there is a notion that in ancient India education was not available to women, or in really early India education was not available to women, and also the stages of life. The four stages of life was only for men and not for women. That is not true. My examination of the women in the Mahabharata revealed almost all of the women, not almost all of the women, were decently educated. They quoted the Shastras when necessary, and they actually took the stages of life very seriously. Towards the end of the life, they took sannyasa. Satyavati took sannyasa, and almost all heroics undertake sannyasa towards the end of their life. So the notion that this is not available doesn't seem based on evidence, because Mahabharata shows that everyone, Satyavati actually comes from a fisher woman, boat riding background, right? But she also quotes Shastras whenever necessary, and she also undertakes sannyasa towards the end of her life when she feels it was time for her. She makes her decisions, right? So all heroics made their own decisions themselves. They took the stages very seriously. They took the sannyasa when they thought it was appropriate for them. So this shows the feminine heroics, feminine divine, uh, had availability of education and freedom of choice, as well as freedom to live the life the way it was appropriate at that time, as it was okay for the same for the men also, right? They also have their duties and they also have their stages, so same for the women also. So that's what Mahabharata has shown. Ramayana, I have only studied Sita, well educated. but more work needs to be done on other feminine heroics of the epic. But based on my work up to now, Sita as well as widely on Mahabharata, I can say women had large availability to education, as large availability to make their decision, as well as the stages, the ashramas are also same for women. There were no cultural restrictions on women to change themselves to fit into other norms.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Even according to Jain Ramayana and Mahabharata, both Sita as well as Draupadi at later stages in their life became sannyasis. And
Right.
Sita is said to have been educated by female teachers, feminine teachers also, like Gargi and
Mhm.
Maitreyi.
Mhm.
So, absolutely, that kind of society where everybody was treated equally was there.
Right. Right.
Yes,
Especially during the epic period. Yeah.
yes, ma'am. Uh, so we have come to the end of this lecture, and ma'am, thank you so much for giving us this new perspective towards the divine feminine as well as feminine heroics, as well as the feminine in general. Because we have to come out of that labeling tendency that we have, where women are looked upon only as mothers or spouses or sisters of somebody. They have their own identity, they are their own person, and we also, as history enthusiasts, we are working towards this. We are bringing out a book called Sanskriti, which is going to focus on the journey of women throughout the ages, and we have given a lot of different sub themes for that. We have received several papers, and we will definitely focus on what you have today presented, ma'am. It has given us a lot of new perspective. So, on behalf of myself and Nidhi, I thank you so much for accepting our invitation and spending your valuable time with us today. Thank you, ma'am. I also thank our viewers, uh, especially Professor Ravi Korishettar sir, Professor S.K. Aruni sir, Professor R.M. Shadaksharaya sir, and Professor Usha Devi ma'am for joining us today and being actively participant. So thank you very much to all our viewers. And last but not the least, I also want to thank my dear friend, Ms. Nidhi Katti, for being a wonderful co-host. Thank you, one and all. We are signing off. Tomorrow's lecture will be by Dr. Amita Gupta. It is on the topic of the forgotten metal technology of the Himalayas. It's a very interesting topic, and I request all our viewers to join us tomorrow at 7 p.m. live to learn more about this metal technology of the Himalayas. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.